Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In this episode, you're going to learn how to accept a one-time payment using a custom form with the payment element. If you're looking for a simpler integration path, we have the no-code payment links option where you can set up a payment link directly through the dashboard and then share that with your customers through social media, email, text message, etc. Alternatively, there's another option called Stripe Checkout. This is a very simple integration that has one API call on the server. You redirect your customer to a Stripe hosted page. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about integrating the payment element. This allows you to build your own custom hosted form and collect lots of different payment method types. So the payment element supports anything from cards all the way to bank accounts. You've got support for wallets like Google Pay and Apple Pay, all the way to buy now, pay later like Affirm and Afterpay, ClearPay. So it is a great option for building your own custom form to accept a one-time payment. So just as a quick roadmap for today, we're going to install a sample, then we're going to go through the dashboard and talk about how you can enable payment methods. These are going to be those payment methods that are dynamically rendered into the payment element every time the page loads. And then we're going to create a payment intent on the server and use its client secret to render the payment element on the client so that we can collect payment details from the customer. We'll ultimately submit that payment to Stripe. And then we're going to handle any of those post-processing events. We're going to talk about webhooks and a few other considerations that you might want to think about as you're building out your integration. So let's get into it. So if you want to follow along with today's demo, what I recommend is head over to the Visual Studio Code extension gallery. If you haven't already installed the Stripe for VS Code extension, it's going to be a game changer for building Stripe integration. So from the Stripe extension, we're going to use one of the samples here. So we're going to click on Start with a Sample. And now we're going to search for Starter. And we're going to use the main integration. We're just going to use an HTML front end today. And we'll be building this with Node. We'll call our sample starter-node. And we're going to pick where we want that sample to be cloned into. We'll say that we want to open this in the same window, and we are off to the races. So each sample comes with a server and a client. We're going to be spending our time mostly in server.js and in index.html. Now with the Stripe for VS Code extension, our .env file was already populated with our publishable key, secret key, and a webhook signing secret that's used. Under the hood, it's using the Stripe CLI. So if these environment variables were not already set, you'll want to go grab those from your Stripe dashboard and populate them so that you can follow along too. Now in server.js, this example comes with a whole bunch of routes already defined. There's one for retrieving the root route to render this index.html page. There's a route for fetching the publishable key client side with JavaScript, and we'll talk about why we want to do that in a little bit. Next, there is this route already created for creating a payment intent. We're going to implement that today. And then finally, there is already a webhook handler skeleton here for you. So you can kind of drop in and add your own event types as you want to handle several different webhook event notifications. We also have index.js, which for now is just this very basic sample. What we can do is we can open up the terminal, change into the server directory and say npm install to install our dependencies. Now we can say npm start to run the server. The server is running at localhost 4242, which we can view in the browser. And this is all that we have to start. In the next section, we're going to jump into the Stripe dashboard to talk about how you can enable different payment method types for your customers. Now from the Stripe dashboard, we can head over to the settings and to the payment method settings. This is where we can manage our payment methods and enable or disable different ways that customers can pay through our payment element. So you'll see here that we have cards enabled, Link, Apple Pay, Google Pay, several different wallet methods. There's lots of different bank redirects. These are popular across Europe. We also have some buy now, pay later payment methods that are enabled. Finally, we even have ACH direct debit as one of the payment methods that customers could use. Now, if we wanted to enable Canadian pre-authorized debits, we could click turn on, and this would enable us to use Canadian pre-authorized debits as a payment method type inside of our payment flows. So this is where we manage our payment methods. And these are the payment methods that will be dynamically derived inside of our payment element when we render that and show it to customers. Instead of needing to deploy any new code, you can just come into the dashboard and enable or disable different payment method types. Here's a high-level overview of the flow we're going to build today. Customers are going to land on the page, And we're going to make an AJAX request back to our server where we're going to make an API call to Stripe to create a payment intent. And that payment intent's client secret is going to be used back on the client in order to render the payment element. That payment element is going to be inside of a form that customers will populate with their billing details, and then ultimately we're going to client-side make a request to submit those payment details all the way to Stripe, and then Stripe will redirect the customer to some return URL, and ultimately we'll be able to display some completed status. And finally, we'll handle webhooks in webhook notifications to actually do the fulfillment of the thing that was purchased by the customer. So let's jump into this first step, which is creating the payment intent on the server. We're going to make this API call to create the payment intent on the server and return its client secret back to the client. So back inside of VS Code here, I'm going to jump over to the server and we're going to add a new route here. So I'm going to say app.post, and our route is going to be create payment intent. And this is going to just take in the request and response. And for now, what we're going to do is just create a payment intent. So I can say Stripe payment intent create, and I can hit tab. That's because I have that Stripe for VS Code extension installed. It knows all of the API calls, and it knows that we're in JavaScript land. All right, so the amount here that we're going to pass, this is in cents. So I'm going to say this is $10.99 USD. Now this amount, you might want to derive this in some way based on what's passed in from the request. So for instance, if someone lands on a product page, you might pass in the ID of the product and then look up the product in the database. So for instance, you might have like some product ID, and that's actually coming in from a request body or something. And then you would like look up the price of the product in the database based on this product ID, and then use that price as the amount. You don't want to pass the amount from the client back to the server unless you want customers to define their amount, which is a rare use case or an edge case for donations. Otherwise, if you're accepting the amount from the front end, customers could go in and edit the HTML so that the actual price that's being sent to the server is incorrect. So the right way to do this is to accept in some sort of reference to an ID, or you can just hard code a flat amount as the amount that you want to charge for your payment intent. All right, next we have currency. This could be USD, this could be euros, this can be whatever the the supported currencies are on Stripe. Now, instead of explicitly listing out the payment method types that we want to accept, here we can say automatic payment methods enabled is true. This allows us to derive the payment methods displayed on the payment element from our settings in the dashboard that we just configured. All right, we're going to return some JSON back with the client secret, and that's going to be the payment intent client secret property, like this. Okay, so now if we open up our terminal again, restart the server, and create another terminal window here, we can say curl-x post to localhost 4242/create payment intent. This will test out our new endpoint. So this is the JSON that we got back. That is the client secret property. We now know that our endpoint is correctly set up and our server is listening for post requests on create payment intent. It's going to create that payment intent and give back our payment intent client secret. So that is working well. You could just as easily test that this endpoint is working with Postman or another testing tool, maybe Insomnia. There's a lot of different ways to kind of like debug just the server layer. All right, we are looking good. We have our payment intent created. Again, there's lots of different options that you can pass when you're creating a payment intent. So head over to the API reference and take a look there. You might want to pass reference to an existing customer or to a shipping address, or there's a lot of different things that you can pass in when you're creating a payment intent. So take a look at the docs and see which of those fit your business needs the best. All right, let's collect some payment details on the front end. So the first thing we want to do is just, maybe we'll just say this is accept a payment. We'll add a form here to collect the billing details. And inside of there, we're going to have a div with the ID of payment element. That's where we're going to mount the payment element. Next, we'll also have a button, and this is just going to say pay. And finally, we'll have a div with an ID of error messages. And this will be used to display any error messages that happen as someone is going through the payment flow. We're also going to add an ID to our form so that we can target this from our JavaScript. So we're going to call this the payment form. So if we refresh the page now, we just see a button and no payment element is rendered. That's because we need to write a little bit of JavaScript. Notice that in the HTML here, we're already loading Stripe.js from js.stripe.com. This is a best practice, and you should load this on every single page. That'll help with fighting against fraud. So the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to add a script tag for a local JavaScript file called payment.js that we're going to go implement now. So I'm going to create a new file here. We're going to save it in the client directory. It's going to be called payment.js. And the first thing we want to do is wait for the DOM to be fully loaded. So we're going to say window.add event listener for DOM content loaded. And when the DOM content is loaded, we're going to set up a bunch of different things. First, we're going to fetch the publishable key from the server. Next, we're going to fetch the client secret for the payment intent from the server. We're going to use the fetch API today and make a GET request to /config. That'll return a promise that will resolve with this response object. And we want the JSON out of the response object. So we're going to say r.json. Now this again is going to return another promise that we can await. And this is where we will say we want to pull out the publishable key out of the response body. Okay, so that's going to give us our publishable key. And now we can initialize an instance of Stripe. So we can say Stripe passing in our publishable key. So now we have an instance of the Stripe object, the Stripe.js object on the client that we can then use. Let's also fetch our payment intent from the server. This time we're going to use the fetch API, but instead of a GET request, we need to send a POST request to create payment intent. The way we do that is by passing an object here with the method POST. We also need some headers. We're going to make this the content type of application JSON, and ultimately we might also need to pass in some body that might include our product ID or any other information that we might need in order to derive the price correctly. So for today, we're just going to leave that out. Now again, fetch is going to return a promise that will resolve with a response object that we want to wait for the JSON of, and that whole thing we can await and pull out the client secret. We're going to use this client secret on the next step where we initialize the elements group. So now we can say const elements is stripe.elements. Now, in most elements integrations in the past with traditional card element or SEPA debit element, we would just initialize elements and not pass any arguments. With the payment element, we're going to pass in an options block here that includes the client secret property of the payment intent. This is because this elements group needs to know about the payment intent in order to render the correct payment method types and enable the right features on the payment intent. Okay, now we're going to create a new payment element by saying elements.create payment. And finally, we're going to mount that payment element onto the div that we created earlier, payment element. So this is the CSS selector for the payment element div that we created inside of our form. All right, we can save that. And now if we refresh our page, we can see the payment element is rendered out. Notice that we are rendering several different payment method types here, including EPS, bank contact, ShiroPay, Ideal, etc., in addition to card. Now that's because we enabled those payment method types from the dashboard and we're using automatic payment methods. So this is all looking great. In the next step, we're going to talk about how we can actually submit this payment to Stripe. First, we want to handle the form submission, and then we're going to use some Stripe.js methods to actually submit the payment. So let's grab reference to the form. And we're going to say document.getElement by ID, and we're going to pass in payment-form. And we're going to say, add an event listener to this form for submit. And when the form is submitted, we're going to prevent the default on the event that is passed into our event handler here so that the form is not fully submitted yet, because we want to handle this with JavaScript. Now we're going to call stripe.confirmPayment. And confirm payment takes in an option object. And the first thing we need to pass into this is reference to our elements group. So we're going to say elements. And the second thing that we need at a minimum is confirm params. And confirm params is going to take in a return URL. And this return URL is where the customer will be sent after the end of the payment flow. So we're just going to use window.location.href, and we're going to split that on the question mark and grab the first reference of it. And then we'll just add to it complete.html. So this will just redirect us to some new page called complete.html. That doesn't exist yet, but we'll come back and implement that in a bit. Now, confirm payment by default will always redirect. If you don't want to redirect, you can pass some arguments here that will say only redirect if it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the default is that it's going to go through some flow and redirect back to some complete page or to this return URL. Now, confirm payment does return a promise, and it's possible that promise will resolve with an object that has an error property inside of it. And if there's an error, then we do want to handle that. So we're going to say if there's an error, then we're going to update that. Remember that div that we created here for error messages? So we're going to plop that error inside of there. So we'll grab reference to messages. We're going to say document.getElement by ID for error messages. We're going to set the inner text to error.message. All right, let's go through the flow and see what happens. So we're going to just grab this and we'll drop in our test card that is all 4242, and that will be a successful payment. No, we don't actually want to save that this time. All right, we are redirected to /complete, but that doesn't exist yet. So this is an expected error message. Now, if we look carefully here at the query string param, you'll notice that we have the ID of the payment intent. We also have the payment intent's client secret and a redirect status. We can use this payment intent client secret client side to retrieve the payment intent and display some details here, telling the customer, thank you, and here's how much you were charged and the status of the payment intent. So we're going to do that next. All right, let's create complete.html. So we're going to create a new file here called complete.html. And this is going to look somewhat similar to our index.html. So I'm just going to grab a lot of that context there. And then we'll just close out some of these divs, and we'll close out the body, and we'll close out the HTML. And we should be looking pretty good here. Okay, instead of payment.js, we're going to call this complete.js. And we're also going to create a new one of those. So we're going to call this complete.js. Again, we want to wait till the DOM is loaded. And when the DOM is loaded, we're again going to fetch the publishable key and initialize an instance of Stripe. Now let's extract that payment intent client secret from the query string params. We're going to create a new URL search params object and pass in window.location.href. And we're going to be able to pull out the client secret from params.get payment intent client secret. Now we can use that client secret to retrieve the payment intent. So on Stripe.js, there is a method called retrieve payment intent, and it takes in that client secret property. This will return a promise that will resolve with an object that might have a payment intent on it. All right, let's render out the content of this payment intent. We're just going to render its JSON into a pre-tag. So let's drop a pre-tag into the HTML, and then we're going to grab reference to that pre-tag here. So we'll say payment intent pre is document.getElement by ID payment intent, and then we're going to say payment intent pre-tag dot inner text is going to be equal to JSON.stringify of the payment intent, and we'll pass null to just so that it looks nice. So if we refresh the page here, this is the JSON content for the payment intent. So you could imagine displaying the amount that was charged and the status of that payment. If you wanted, you could also expand the payment method and show some details about maybe the last 4 digits of the card that was used, etc. So this is how we might build a completion or a success page, letting the customer know that they have gone through the payment flow successfully. Now, there's lots of different states that our payment intent might be in. One important thing to note is that this completion page should not actually be used for fulfillment. It's possible the browser closes or the customer loses internet. And so instead of using the completion page as the signal to start fulfillment, what we want to do instead is use the webhook handler. So back inside of server.js, recall that we already have this webhook endpoint sort of wired up. Now, in the Stripe for VS Code extension, there are several tools for testing and building with webhook endpoints. So what we can do is we can say forward events to, this is under the events section. We're going to say forward events to. Now we need to enter the URL where we want those events delivered. In this case, localhost 4242/webhook. Now there's going to be two places to enter a URL. The first is for account webhook events or direct webhook events. These are events that are firing on your Stripe account that are related to your account. If you are using Connect, Stripe Connect, in order to build a platform or marketplace, the Connect events would be for your connected accounts. So we're going to just use the same URL for both. Notice in the terminal output here, we're seeing that our webhook endpoint is up and ready and listening for notifications. So if we were to go back to our page here, you'll see that a payment intent was created and the payment intent.created event was delivered to our webhook endpoint, and we see this 200 status code. Now, there are several different event types that you can handle. Here we are handling the payment intent succeeded webhook event, and we're logging out to the server log payment captured. So if we were to watch our server log here and go through this payment flow and enter in again a payment method type, then you'll see inside of our server log, we can see that payment was captured. So by using this forward events tool that's part of the Stripe for VS Code extension, we are forwarding those events directly into our webhook handler. So this forms a direct connection between your Stripe account and your local running server. So you don't need to use tunneling software like ngrok, or you don't need to expose this to the public internet, and you can use the Stripe CLI and this Stripe for VS Code extension directly to build and test your webhook handling. Note that when you go to production and you're pushing your webhook endpoint live, you'll get a public-facing URL that you need to enter into the Stripe dashboard and create a new webhook endpoint. You're not going to use this Stripe for VS Code extension or the Stripe CLI in production. Those are only for development. In production, you will enter in a public URL into the Stripe dashboard, and that's where webhook event notifications will be forwarded. You might be wondering how to test out your integration. Well, over in the documentation for accepting a payment, you can drill down into the test integration section, and for each of the different payment method families between cards, wallets, bank redirects, etc., there are several different things that will allow you to test different scenarios. So for instance, we can grab this card, this test card that ends in 3155, and we can use that as one of our test cards inside of the payment element. And you'll notice that as we go through the payment flow here, this will trigger a secure customer authentication payment flow. So this is going to pop up a modal, and in production, this modal would contain a bank account, 2FA, or sort of like a one-time code or some way to verify that the customer is who they say they are and that they are allowed to authenticate this payment. So that's one way that you can test sort of 3D secure and secure customer authentication is with that special card number. There's a bunch of different card numbers and test strings that you can use for different bank accounts. So if you're ready to test your integration, head over to the docs and look at those test strings. Another thing worth noting is in the documentation, there are some optional steps depending on specific payment method types or QR code based payment methods. These might require that you pass additional details when creating the payment intent, or they might have other considerations like with Apple Pay, you'll need to go into the dashboard and make sure that you have an Apple Pay domain set up and verified. So just to review the entire flow, the customer lands on the page and we use any information from that page to create a payment intent using the API. And then when we return that payment intent's client secret to the client, we use that to build out a payment element on our custom form. That's where customers enter their billing details, and then we can submit that payment directly to Stripe client side, and then the customer is redirected to a return URL where we display this return status or this success status, completion status. And finally, we're handling fulfillment with our webhook. That's where we're actually pulling from inventory and printing shipping labels and doing all of those things that we might do when someone buys something from us. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.